The year of our Lord 1879 baked Dust Creek, Wyoming, into a red-dusted brick. The sun, a merciless sovereign, ruled a pale and cloudless sky, bleaching the life from the prairie grass until it surrendered into brittle, yellow wisps. Wind, the sun's restless deputy, carried the grit of the earth everywhere. It settled in the folds of a woman's skirt, seasoned the food on every plate, and etched fine lines around the eyes of the townspeople, making them look older and warier than their years. For Abigail Bell, the minister's wife, it felt as though the dust had settled deep inside her, a fine silt in her very soul. She stood at the window of the parsonage, a small, tidy house that felt more like a cage of piety than a home. From here, she had a perfect view of Main Street. To her left, the First Congregational Church of Dust Creek stood like a wooden sentinel, its steeple aspiring toward a heaven that seemed to have forgotten them. To her right, the street devolved into a mix of commerce and sin. The mercantile, the land office, and, directly across from the hollow anvil smithy, the cattleman's rest saloon, from which the faint, tinny plink of a piano sometimes drifted on the hot air, a sound as alien to Abigail's world as a hymn in a wolf's den. Every sound in Dust Creek was sharpened by the drought. The rhythmic, mournful creak of the windmill behind the church was the town's heartbeat, a constant prayer for water. And then there was the new sound, the one that split the day in two with its shriek of iron and steam, the train. Its whistle was a promise of somewhere else, a world of green lawns and gentle rain she remembered from her life back east, a life that felt as distant as a star. The railroad was progress, her husband Josiah had declared, a sign of God's plan unfolding. To Abigail, it felt more like an accusation, a reminder of all the world she had left behind to come to this thirsty land. Josiah was a good man. Everyone in Dust Creek said so. He was kind. His sermons were filled with a righteous fire, and his devotion to God was as solid and unyielding as the granite foothills to the west. But his goodness was a vast, open plain, and Abigail often felt she was wandering it alone. His gaze was fixed on the heavens, or more recently, on the architectural drawings for the new, grander church he envisioned. The current building was humble, built by the first settlers. Josiah dreamed of stone walls and stained glass, a monument to faith that would rival any in Cheyenne. He was bent over those plans now. At the dining table they rarely dined at together. His brow was furrowed in concentration, a lock of sandy hair falling across his forehead. He spoke without looking up. "Abigail, my dear, did you review the list for the bake sale, Mrs.? Pratt is concerned about our contribution. The foundation for the new nave will not fund itself." She turned from the window, smoothing the front of her simple calico dress. "Yes, Josiah. I have spoken with the ladies. We will have more than enough pies to sell." "Excellent. The Lord's work requires practical hands." He finally looked at her, his blue eyes kind but distant, as if seeing not his wife but another member of his congregation, a useful cog in the grand machinery of his purpose. He smiled, a brief, dutiful upturn of his lips. "You are a blessing, Abigail." The words, meant to be a comfort, landed like small, smooth stones in the hollow space inside her. A blessing, a helpmeet, a minister's wife. She was all of these things. But she was also just Abigail, a woman of 27 years who loved the smell of rain on dry earth and the feel of a good book in her hands. A woman who taught the town's children their letters with a patience Josiah reserved for Scripture. She longed, in quiet moments she barely admitted to herself, to be seen, to be heard, not just for her utility, but for the simple, unadorned fact of her being. Her gaze drifted back to the window, past the church, to the pulsing heart of heat and noise across the street. The hollow anvil, Eli Harper's smithy. Even from here, she could hear the rhythmic song of his hammer on steel, a steady, powerful beat, clang, clang, hiss. It was a sound of creation, of something being forged from raw material by sheer will and strength. It was the most alive sound in Dust Creek. She did not know Mr. Harper well. No one did. He had arrived 3 years ago, a tall, quiet man with arms thick with muscle and eyes the color of a stormy sky. He had bought the old smithy, hung a new sign, and set to work. He mended wagons, shod horses, and repaired plows with a skill that was undeniable. He spoke little, charged a fair price, and kept to himself. The men said he had been a cavalryman, that he had seen things in the wars that had quieted his tongue. The women whispered about the way he moved, with a coiled grace that seemed out of place in a man of his size. They noted that he never went to the saloon, nor did he attend church. Yet he treated every woman, from the most pious wife to the painted ladies who worked at the Cattleman's Rest, with the same quiet, unwavering respect. Abigail watched him now as he emerged from the deep shadows of the smithy, leading a horse. He moved with an unhurried confidence, his hands gentle on the animal's bridle. He was bare to the waist, his chest and back slick with sweat that gleamed in the harsh sunlight. He ran a hand through his dark hair, pushing it back from his brow, and then spoke to the rancher holding the reins. Abigail could not hear the words, but she saw the rancher nod and then laugh. Even from this distance, she saw the warmth that settled in Eli Harper's eyes when he smiled. It was a rare sight, and it made him seem younger than his 33 years. A sudden commotion at the side of the church pulled her attention away. Mrs. Gable, whose property bordered the churchyard, was flapping her apron at a stray longhorn that was placidly chewing on the head of one of the stone doves flanking the entrance steps. "Shoo! Get out of it, you heathen beast!" she screeched, her voice thin and reedy. Reverend Bell, the devil's own cattle are desecrating the house of the Lord." Josiah sighed, the sound of a patient man tried by the small-mindedness of his flock. He placed a paperweight on his precious drawings and rose from the table. "Yes, Mrs. Gable, I am coming." Abigail followed him to the door, a small smile playing on her lips despite herself. The humor of daily life in Dust Creek was as dry as the soil, but it was there if you knew where to look. Josiah strode out with purpose, clapping his hands at the beast. "Away with you, now off church property." The cow looked at him with liquid brown eyes, chewed thoughtfully for a moment longer on the stone wing, and then ambled away with a flick of its tail. Mrs. Gable was not appeased. "It is a disgrace. Reverend, first the drought, now this, and the railroad, bringing all sorts of rough men to town. A woman is not safe to walk the street. Virtue is in short supply." Her eyes flicked toward the saloon, and then, as if by association, to the smithy across from it. Abigail knew that look. In Dust Creek, a woman's reputation was a delicate thing, a piece of fine china in a world of iron and rock. It was guarded by a set of unwritten rules, a code of conduct as rigid as any scripture. A proper woman kept her eyes downcast, her opinions to herself, and her activities confined to the spheres of home and church. Abigail, with her Eastern education and her quiet love for walking along the dry creek bed, already felt the weight of their scrutiny. She was the preacher's wife, a living symbol of virtue, and any crack in her facade would be noted, whispered about, and magnified. Josiah offered placating words to Mrs. Gable, promising to speak with the cattle foreman. As he turned to go back inside, Abigail lingered on the porch. She felt the thin gold band on her left hand. It felt cool against her skin in the oppressive heat. It had been her mother's, a simple, unadorned circle of gold. It was her bond, her promise, her duty. It was the symbol of her life with Josiah, a life of faith and service. But lately, it had begun to feel less like a circle of love and more like a shackle, binding her to a path she was not sure she had ever truly chosen for herself. Across the street, Eli Harper had finished with the horse. He dipped a ladle into the water barrel outside his forge and drank deeply, the water running in rivulets down his chin and chest. He looked up then, his gaze sweeping the street, And for a brief, startling moment, his eyes met Abigail's. He did not smile, nor did he look away. He simply held her gaze, a flicker of acknowledgement in the stormy depths of his eyes. There was no judgment in his look, no speculation, just a quiet seeing. Abigail felt a blush creep up her neck. She dropped her gaze instantly, her heart thumping a guilty rhythm against her ribs. She turned and hurried back into the cool, dim silence of the parsonage. It was improper. A preacher's wife should not be caught staring at a half-naked blacksmith. It was a small thing, a meaningless moment. But in Dust Creek, such moments were the seeds from which scandal grew. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the ring, the weight of it. Across the street, the sound of the hammer began again. Clang, clang, hiss. It was the sound of a man shaping the world to his will, forging a new reality from fire and steel. Abigail closed her eyes. The sound was not a judgment or an accusation. It felt, strangely, like a question, and in the lonely silence of her heart, she had no answer to give. The dust motes danced in the bars of sunlight slanting through the window, each one a tiny, unspoken secret in the still, hot air of the Wyoming summer. The train whistled its mournful cry in the distance, and the windmill groaned its endless, thirsty prayer. Dust Creek held its breath, waiting for the rain that would not come. The Saturday market was the one time the town of Dust Creek felt truly alive, a brief respite from the silent siege of the drought. Wagons lined the wide expanse of Main Street, their beds laden with what little the parched earth had been persuaded to yield tough-skinned squash, dusty potatoes, and jars of preserved peaches from the previous, kinder year. Women gathered in small, chattering clusters, their bonnets bobbing like a field of cotton flowers, trading recipes and gossip with equal fervor. Abigail stood behind a trestle table laden with the church lady's baked goods, the sweet scent of cinnamon and apple, a small pocket of comfort in the dust-choked air. She offered a polite smile to each customer, her hands moving with practiced grace as she wrapped a loaf of bread or a slice of pie. The sun beat down and the fine red dust settled on everything, turning the white frosting on a cake a delicate shade of pink. The drone of conversation, the nicker of horses, and the distant, rhythmic clang from the hollow anvil forge wove together into the familiar tapestry of a Dust Creek Saturday. Then, the world changed. It began with a subtle shift in the light, a dimming, as if a great hand were passing over the sun. A sudden silence fell over the market as heads turned toward the west. A low, menacing wall of brown was advancing across the prairie, a churning, roiling beast of dust and wind. It devoured the horizon, blotting out the sky. Dust storm! The cry went up, sharp with a fear born of experience. Chaos erupted. Panic was a wild horse bolting through the crowd. Mothers snatched up children, merchants scrambled to cover their wares, and men shouted orders that were lost in the rising shriek of the wind. Abigail's first instinct was to run for the shelter of the church, but then she saw old Mrs. Gable, her face a mask of terror, fumbling with the strings of her bonnet as the first gust of wind tore at her. Abigail did not hesitate. She abandoned her table of pies and hurried to the old woman's side, taking her frail arm. This way, Mrs. Gable. To the mercantile. The wind hit them like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and whipping her skirts around her legs. Grit stung her eyes and filled her mouth. The air grew thick and dark, turning midday into a suffocating twilight. She could hear the splintering crash of a vendor's stall behind them and the frightened wail of a child. She pulled her kerchief up from around her neck, trying to tie it over her nose and mouth to filter the choking dust. Her fingers were clumsy, numb from the sudden chill in the air. She fumbled with the knot, her other hand firmly holding Mrs. Gable, guiding her through the disorienting whirlwind. They stumbled through the door of the mercantile just as the full fury of the storm descended, plunging the street into a near-total darkness. Inside, people huddled together, their faces pale and ghostly in the dim light from the lanterns the shopkeeper had hastily lit. The building groaned under the assault of the wind, and dust seeped through every crack in the walls, a fine, ghostly mist that danced in the lantern light. The storm was violent but brief. As quickly as it had arrived, it moved on, leaving a strange, bruised silence in its wake. The wind died down to a mournful sigh, and a weak, filtered sunlight began to penetrate the haze. People stirred, coughing, and began to move toward the door to survey the damage. Abigail led Mrs. Gable to a crate and made sure she was steady before turning to go back outside. The street was a scene of devastation. Tables were overturned. Canvas awnings were shredded, and a thick blanket of red dust covered everything, softening the sharp edges of the wreckage into a single, sorrowful landscape. A lone wagon wheel rolled slowly in a circle before clattering to a stop. Her table of baked goods was gone, swallowed by the storm. She felt a pang of guilt for abandoning her post, for the lost revenue for Josiah's new church. Her eyes scanned the street, and she felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to check her hand. She lifted her left hand, her fingers caked with grime, and her heart stopped. The ring was gone. The thin gold band, the one that had been her mother's, the one Josiah had placed on her finger in a green, rainy churchyard back east, was not there. The patch of skin where it had rested for 5 years was pale, a ghostly imprint of what had been. A wave of nausea washed over her. She could not breathe. Her gloved fingers flew to the bare spot, tracing the empty circle again and again, as if touch alone could will the ring back into existence. She must have dropped it outside while she was tying her kerchief, while she was wrestling the wind and guiding Mrs. Gable. She turned, her eyes wide with panic, and stared at the chaotic street. It was hopeless. It could be anywhere, buried under inches of fresh dust. A feeling of cold dread, heavier and more suffocating than the storm itself, settled over her. It was more than just a lost piece of jewelry. It was a symbol. To lose her wedding ring was a sign, an omen. The women of the town would see it as a mark of carelessness, a loosening of her vows, a failure not just of attention but of faith. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming, a bitter taste in her throat. "Mrs. Bell." The voice was low and calm, cutting through her panic. She looked up to see Eli Harper standing before her. He must have been helping nearby, for he was covered in the same red dust as everyone else. He was in the process of single-handedly righting a heavy collapsed stall, his muscles cording in his arms with the effort. He stopped his work and looked at her, his expression unreadable but for the concern in his stormy eyes. He held out a piece of damp cloth. "You have dust in your eyes, Mrs. Bell." She took it numbly, her hand trembling. The cloth was cool against her hot, gritty skin. She wiped at her eyes, grateful for the simple, practical kindness. He did not ask what was wrong. He did not pry or offer platitudes. He just stood there, a solid, calming presence in the midst of the wreckage. He looked around at the scattered remains of the market, a wry, humorless smile touching his lips. "After a storm," he said, his voice a low rumble, "only the braggarts and the fools are left standing." His eyes met hers for a second, and she saw not a hint of judgment, only a shared understanding of the capricious power of the land they lived on. He gave a slight nod, as if to say she was neither a braggart nor a fool, and then turned back to his work, his quiet strength a silent rebuke to the chaos around them. When Abigail finally returned to the parsonage, her dress was soiled and her spirit was in tatters. She found Josiah at the dining table, brushing a fine layer of dust from his precious architectural plans. He looked up, his expression one of mild annoyance at the interruption. She told him in a halting whisper, the words catching in her throat, "Josiah, I have lost my ring, my wedding ring." He listened patiently, his head tilted. When she finished, he was silent for a moment, his gaze directed somewhere over her shoulder. "I see," he said at last. His voice was not unkind, but it was devoid of the comfort she so desperately needed. It was the voice he used to explain a difficult passage of Scripture, logical and removed. It is only a material object, Abigail, a symbol. Our true union is before God, not in a band of gold. Perhaps the Lord is testing our faith, reminding us not to place our trust in worldly things. He stood and walked to her, placing a cool hand on her shoulder. Do not be distressed. We will pray on it. He then turned back to his table. I must meet with the deacons this afternoon. Deacon Pratt is most concerned that this disruption to the market has set back our fundraising schedule. The new church will not build itself. The space that had opened in her heart now felt like a vast, empty canyon. He did not understand. He did not see the terror in her eyes, did not feel the weight of what this meant in a town like Dust Creek. He saw only an inconvenience, a theological lesson, a delay in his grand project. The loneliness she had felt by the window that morning returned with a crushing force. By evening, the whispers had begun. News of the lost ring spread faster than a prairie fire. As she walked to the mercantile for flour, she felt the eyes on her back. She saw the women stop their conversations as she passed, their heads drawing close together as soon as she was out of earshot. The wind carried their judgment as surely as it carried the dust. She saw Deacon Pratt standing outside the land office, speaking with two other men from the church council. He was a portly man with small, shrewd eyes and a piety that always seemed to Abigail to be more about power than faith. He was a land agent for the railroad, a position that made him one of the most influential men in town. As she passed, his voice rose, carrying a sharp, sanctimonious edge. A preacher's wife, he said, just loud enough for her to hear, to lose a wedding ring right there in the street, in front of the saloon. No less, it is a most troubling sign, a symbol of a bond, loosened. His words struck her like stones. He had linked her loss to the one place in town that represented sin and disorder, creating a narrative of moral failing. The fine red dust that clung to her hair suddenly felt like a physical manifestation of the town's suspicion, a curse she could not wash away. Inside her, a battle raged. The dutiful, God-fearing wife knew she should accept this as a trial of her faith, just as Josiah had said. But the woman, the lonely, frightened woman, felt a rising tide of rebellion. It was unjust. It was cruel. From his forge. Eli Harper heard the whispers too. He had seen the way Pratt looked at her, the way the other women's eyes followed her down the street. It made something hot and hard coil in his gut. He had known men like Pratt in the army, men who used righteousness as a club to beat others down. He knew the loneliness he saw in Mrs. Bell's eyes, the look of someone stranded on a barren shore. He had felt it himself for years. His first instinct was to intervene, to say something, to shut Pratt's mouth, but he held himself back. He was an outsider, a man with his own ghosts. Interfering would only make it worse for her, would only give the gossips more fuel for their fire. He had a code, forged in the heat and violence of his past. You respect a marriage. You keep your distance, and you do not cause a woman any more trouble than the world has already given her. So he kept his peace. But his hammer fell on the glowing steel of a horseshoe with a ringing, furious energy that echoed the town's own unsteady heartbeat. That night, Abigail could not sleep. She stood at her window, looking out at the moonlit street. The wreckage of the market had been cleared away, but the dust remained, a pale shroud over everything. She held her left hand up in the moonlight, looking at the naked finger. It felt wrong, incomplete. Josiah's words about faith in material things echoed in her mind, but they offered no comfort. This was not about gold. It was about her honor. It was about her mother's memory. It was about refusing to be defined by the whispers of small-minded people. A quiet, fierce resolve began to build in her, a strength she had not known she possessed. Josiah would pray. The town would whisper. But she would act. She would find the ring. She would walk every inch of that dusty street. She would sift through the dirt with her own 2 hands if she had to. She would face the stares and the insinuations, and she would find what was lost. It was more than a search for a ring. It was a journey to find herself, to prove that her faith was not a fragile thing to be blown away by a storm, but something stronger, something that could be forged anew, even in the heart of the dust. The next morning, Abigail began her search at dawn, before the town was fully awake and the sun had begun its assault. She told Josiah she was going for a walk to clear her head. A half-truth he accepted with a distracted nod, his mind already on a sermon about the vanity of earthly possessions. She slipped out of the parsonage with a small garden trowel, her heart a tight, anxious knot in her chest. She started in the market square, the scene of the disaster. The area had been swept, but the dust lay in thick drifts against the foundations of the buildings and along the boardwalk. She began to work methodically, her head bowed, her bonnet shielding her face from the few early risers who were beginning to stir. She ignored their curious glances, the way conversations paused as she passed. She focused on the ground, scooping and sifting the red dirt through her fingers. Her hands, accustomed to the gentle work of turning pages and kneading dough, were soon scraped and grimy. The dust worked its way under her fingernails, a constant, gritty reminder of her loss. After an hour, with nothing to show for her efforts but sore knees and a deepening sense of despair, she moved on. She followed the path of the storm's retreat toward Dry Creek, the shallow, winding arroyo that marked the southern edge of town. In a normal year, it would be flowing with clear, cool water. Now, it was a scar on the land, a cracked and blistering map of thirst. The bones of small fish lay like delicate white fossils in the dried mud. A solitary hawk circled high overhead, a patient hunter in the vast, empty sky. Here, away from the prying eyes of the town, Abigail allowed a few silent tears to trace clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. She walked the bank, her eyes scanning every rock and clump of withered grass. But the ring was not there. Her last hope was the ugly, sprawling pile of coal dust, ash and slag that sat behind the hollow anvil. The smithy's refuse heap was a small black mountain, and the storm had blasted a fresh layer of red dust over it. It was a filthy, unladylike place to be searching, but she reasoned that a small, heavy object could easily have been blown this far and settled into the dark, gritty landscape. Eli Harper was already at work. The steady ring of his hammer was the only sound besides the sighing of the wind. A supply wagon was parked near the forge, and Eli was fitting a new shoe to one of the draft horses. His back to Abigail, he worked with a focused, rhythmic grace, his movements economical and powerful. She kept her distance, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment at being seen here, grubbing in the dirt like a desperate child. The sun was higher now, and the dark slag heap absorbed the heat, radiating it back at her. The ground was hot to the touch, and she winced as she knelt and began to sift through the sharp, grimy material. It was then that the train whistle blew, a long, piercing shriek that sliced through the morning air. It was closer than usual, on the new spur that ran near the Latham Ranch lands. The sound spooked a small herd of cattle being driven down the alley between the smithy and the livery. They were young steers, already on edge from the heat and thirst, and the whistle was like a lit match to a powder keg. They bolted. The drover's shout was lost in the thunder of hooves on hard-packed earth. They poured out of the alley, a river of horns and panicked muscle, heading directly for the open space where Abigail was kneeling. She looked up, her eyes widening in terror. For a frozen second, she could not move, mesmerized by the approaching wave of destruction. Her mind registered the rolling eyes, the dust pluming from their hooves, the sheer, unstoppable force of them. She was not aware of Eli moving until he was there. He covered the distance between the forge and the coal pile in 3 long strides. He did not shout. He simply acted. His hand clamped around her upper arm, a firm, brief pressure that was not rough but left no room for argument. He hauled her to her feet and half pulled, half threw her behind the solid mass of the supply wagon. shielding her with his own body just as the first of the steers thundered past. The ground shook. The air was thick with the smell of animals and fear. Abigail pressed herself against the rough wooden planks of the wagon, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. Eli stood in front of her, his body a solid wall, his hand still resting lightly on her shoulder to keep her steady. The stampede was over in moments. The cattle disappeared down the street in a cloud of dust, the drover in hot, cursing pursuit. The sudden silence was deafening. Abigail could hear nothing but the ragged sound of her own breathing and the ringing in her ears. Eli took a step back, and his hand immediately dropped from her shoulder. He turned to face her, his expression grim. A deep line was etched between his brows. "I apologize," he said, his voice low and a little rough. "I had to touch your arm." The formal, respectful words were so at odds with the violent immediacy of the moment that she could only stare at him. He had just saved her from being trampled, and he was apologizing for a necessary breach of etiquette. She finally found her voice, though it came out as a breathless whisper. "Thank you, Mr. Harper. You were very quick. A man learns to move fast in this country," he said, his eyes scanning her to make sure she was unharmed. "Or he does not last long. Are you looking for a ring, dearie, or for the man with the hammer?" The voice, sharp as cider and twice as tart, came from the end of the alley. Hattie Mills, the town's most formidable baker and purveyor of pies, stood with her hands on her ample hips, a knowing glint in her eye. She had seen the whole thing from her kitchen window. Abigail's face flamed with a hot, mortifying blush. She felt her reputation, already so fragile, crumbling into dust right at her feet. She opened her mouth to stammer a denial, an explanation, anything, but no words came. Eli Harper turned his head slowly to look at the woman. His expression did not change. His voice, when he spoke, was as calm and steady as the deep water of a well. "My hammer is heavy. Mrs. Mills, rumors are light. I imagine you have pies that need your attention." It was not a threat, nor was it rude, but it was an undeniable dismissal. Hattie Mills, who could stare down a drunken cowboy without blinking, had the good grace to look momentarily abashed. She gave a curt nod and disappeared back into her bakery. Abigail let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. She looked at Eli, a silent thank you in her eyes. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in return, and turned back toward his forge, as if pulling a woman from the path of a stampede and deflecting a town gossip were all in a morning's work. Later that day, as she taught the Sunday school lessons in the stifling heat of the church hall, Abigail found her thoughts drifting back to the morning's events. The children were her staunchest allies. They did not care about lost rings or whispers. They only knew that Mrs. Bell told the best stories and always had a kind word for them. Young Thomas, the sheriff's son, had even presented her with a rusty nail he had found, assuring her it was a very lucky kind of treasure. Their simple loyalty was a balm to her frayed spirit. She noticed, as the children were settling on the benches, that the wobbly leg on the one in the front row had been fixed. Looking closer, she saw that all the benches, which had been growing rickety with age and use, felt solid and steady. The joints were reinforced with small, elegantly curved iron brackets, hammered and fitted with a skill that was unmistakable. There was no name on the work, no announcement of the good deed. It was a signature written in steel, a quiet act of kindness that asked for nothing in return. Her path home took her past the land office, where she saw Deacon Pratt in deep conversation with the man who owned the town's only reliable well. Since the drought had worsened, the price of a barrel of water had tripled, a fact that hit the town's poorer families the hardest. Pratt clapped the man on the back, a gesture of conspiratorial success, and as he turned, he saw Abigail. He gave her a smile that did not reach his shrewd, calculating eyes. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Bell," he said, his tone oozing a false sympathy. Still searching. I see. A terrible shame. A symbol of one's commitment. Gone so carelessly. It does make one wonder about the state of things. She met his gaze directly, her chin held high. I have lost a piece of property. Deacon Pratt, my commitment is a matter between myself and God. It is not for you to wonder about. She walked on, leaving him sputtering, his pious mask having slipped for just a moment. Eli watched her go from the shadows of his forge. He had seen the encounter with Pratt. He felt that familiar, hot coil of anger in his gut, but he banked it down, turning it into the heat that softened iron. He had spent years learning to control his fire. His time in the cavalry had been a landscape of chaos and regret. He had seen enough violence and death to last a lifetime, and it had left him with a deep-seated conviction that he was not a man meant for gentle things. He felt tainted, unworthy of the kind of quiet goodness Abigail Bell represented, and so he kept his distance. The kindness he showed her, repairing the benches, pulling her from harm's way, was not the overture of a suitor. It was the simple, instinctual respect a decent man shows to someone in need. It was a form of atonement, a way to build something solid and good in a world he had once only helped to tear apart. That evening, Abigail returned to the coal pile. She could not let it go. It was her last chance. The sun was setting, painting the pale sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, the colors of a fresh bruise. The air was cooling, but the slag still held the day's heat. She knelt again, her hands raw and aching, and began to dig. The sharp edges of the coal bits scraped her palms. A small, sharp piece sliced her finger, and she drew back with a hiss of pain, bringing the finger to her mouth. You will hurt yourself. Eli stood a few feet away, wiping his hands on a rag. He had finished his work for the day. He held out a thick, singed leather glove. It was stiff with use and smelled of sweat, smoke, and hot metal. Here, he said, use this. She hesitated. It felt like an impossibly intimate gesture. Yet there was nothing improper about it. It was a simple, practical offering. She took it. The leather was warm and shaped to his hand. She slipped it on. It was far too large, but it covered her own hand in a rough, protective embrace. He saw her looking at it, and a flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. Sometimes, he said, his voice quiet, you must borrow the strength of the fire so you do not get burned by it. He did not stay to watch her. He turned and disappeared into the deepening shadows of the hollow anvil, leaving her alone in the twilight. Abigail looked down at the heavy glove on her hand. The ring was still lost, but as she clenched her fist, feeling the worn, strong leather protect her skin, she felt for the first time that she was not entirely alone in her search. For a week, the sky remained a cruel, empty blue, but a change was coming. It was not a promise of relief, but a different kind of threat. While the sun still baked the streets of Dust Creek, the air grew heavy, thick with a humidity that felt unnatural. To the west, the mountains that were usually a sharp, solid presence against the horizon grew hazy, their peaks shrouded in dark, bruised-looking clouds that sulked and refused to move. The townspeople watched them with suspicion. It was a mountain storm, a localized fury that would spend its water on the high rocks and gullies, sending them none of the life-giving rain they prayed for. The first sign of trouble was not a sound, but a smell, a damp, earthy scent. The perfume of wet soil and decaying leaves drifted down into the valley. Then came the sound, a low, distant roar, like a freight train where there were no tracks. It grew steadily, a deep-throated rumble that vibrated in the soles of their feet. People came out of the shops and houses, their faces turned toward Dry Creek. The arroyo, which had been a ribbon of cracked mud an hour before, was now a churning, angry torrent, a flash flood. The mountain storm had disgorged its contents into the high canyons, and now the runoff, a thick, brown wave of water, mud, and debris, was surging through the town's lowest point. It was not a deep flood, but it was powerful, a liquid battering ram. It tore at the creek's banks, carrying with it fallen branches, clumps of sagebrush, and the refuse of the town that had accumulated in the dry bed. Sheriff Latham was the first to organize the response. Sandbags. We need to shore up the bank by the bridge if that goes. The whole west end of town could be in trouble. The cry for action shook the town from its heat-induced lethargy. Men ran from the saloon and the mercantile, their personal disputes forgotten in the face of a common enemy. Women emerged from their homes, gathering ropes and buckets. It was a frantic, chaotic dance of survival. Abigail was among them. The search for her ring, the whispers, the weight of her own private sorrow, all of it was washed away by the immediate, urgent need of the community. She joined a line of women and children passing empty grain sacks toward the men working frantically at the water's edge. The air was filled with shouts, the roar of the water, and the splintering groan of the small wooden footbridge that spanned the creek. She saw Eli Harper in the heart of the chaos, his strength a focal point in the swirling action. He was waist-deep in the muddy, surging water, wrestling a heavy railroad tie into place to brace the bridge's support pillar. His face was set in a grim mask of concentration, his muscles straining as he fought the current. He did not seem to notice the danger, only the work that needed to be done. A group of boys, caught up in the excitement, began flinging clods of mud at a fence post, pretending to be soldiers repelling an attack. Eli, seeing them, paused for a moment after heaving the timber into place. He wiped a muddy forearm across his brow, leaving a streak of red dirt. "Careful there, boys," he called out, his voice a low rumble that carried over the sound of the water. "Do not throw mud at the blacksmith. It is liable to catch a spark." The boys stopped, their eyes wide, before breaking into delighted laughter. The small moment of humor broke the tension, a brief, shared breath in the midst of the crisis. Abigail, handing a sack to the person next to her, felt a smile touch her own lips. The water rose for another hour, licking at the top of the reinforced bank, before it began, almost imperceptibly, to recede. The roar softened to a gurgle, leaving behind a thick, stinking layer of mud and a tangled mess of debris. The immediate danger had passed, but the work was not over. The creek bed was choked, and the wreckage had to be cleared before it dried into a permanent, ugly scar. Everyone who could hold a shovel or a rake set to the task. Abigail worked alongside the other women, pulling sodden branches and garbage from the muck. Her dress was ruined. Her hands were covered in filth, but she felt a sense of purpose she had not felt in weeks. She was part of something, a functioning piece of the town, not just the preacher's lonely wife. Eli was working further down, near the slag pile behind his forge, where a massive tangle of uprooted cottonwood trees had snagged against the bank. He worked with a grim efficiency, using a heavy pry bar to loosen the logs, his body moving with a powerful, practiced rhythm. As he dislodged a large, waterlogged branch, he saw it, a small glint of yellow gold, half buried in the black mud and tangled roots. His heart gave a sudden, hard jolt. Her ring. It had to be. The storm must have washed it down the street and into the creek, and now this second flood had brought it to light. He reached down, his fingers closing around the object. He pulled it free and wiped it on his trousers, his pulse quickening with a strange, protective joy. He would be the one to end her suffering, to return what was lost. He opened his hand. The ring that lay on his muddy palm was indeed gold, a simple man's wedding band. But as he turned it over, he saw the engraving on the inside. It was not a sentimental verse or a date. It was two initials, crudely scratched into the soft metal, M.P. Not her ring. He felt a sharp pang of disappointment, followed immediately by a cold, calculating curiosity. M.P. He knew of only one man in town with those initials who held a position of public piety. Deacon Pratt, Martin Pratt, a married man, a deacon of the church. Eli looked from the ring in his hand to the town rising up from the creek bank, and a piece of a puzzle he did not know he was solving clicked into place. He closed his hand around the ring, the metal cool against his skin. This was a secret, and a dangerous one. He slipped it into his pocket, his face an unreadable mask. By the time the sun began to set, the worst of the cleanup was done. The townsfolk, exhausted, muddy, and united in their shared labor, began to disperse. It was in this moment of communal fatigue and relief that Deacon Pratt chose to make his move. He gathered a group of the town's leading citizens, including Josiah, near the damaged footbridge. "My friends," Pratt began, his voice ringing with a false sincerity, "we have been tested today, and we have persevered, but we must see this for what it is, a sign from the Almighty." He gestured toward the church, its steeple serene against the bruised evening sky. "Our beloved church, the very heart of our community, sits on this vulnerable low ground. What if this flood had been worse? What if our house of worship had been swept away?" A murmur of agreement went through the small crowd. "Providence," Pratt continued, his voice rising, "has presented us with an opportunity, a solution. The railroad is eager to acquire this parcel of land for a new freight depot. They are prepared to make a most generous offer, an offer so generous, Reverend Bell," he said, turning directly to Josiah, "that we could build a new church, a magnificent church of stone and stained glass, on the high ground east of town, a testament to our faith and our foresight, safe from any future calamities." Abigail, who had been standing nearby, felt a chill go through her despite the warm evening. She saw it all with perfect clarity. Pratt owned that high ground. This was not providence. It was profit, wrapped in the flag of piety. She looked at her husband, expecting to see him dismiss this cynical, opportunistic ploy. But Josiah's eyes were shining. He was not looking at Pratt, or the damaged creek, or his exhausted congregation. He was looking at a vision in his mind, a vision of the grand new church he had been dreaming of for years. The stone walls, the towering steeple, the colored light filtering through stained glass windows. Pratt was not offering a deal. He was offering the fulfillment of Josiah's most cherished ambition. "A stone church," Josiah murmured, the words full of awe. "It would be a beacon for this entire territory." Later that night, in the stifling quiet of the parsonage, Abigail confronted him. "You cannot be seriously considering it. Josiah, tearing down our church, the one built by the founders of this town to give the land to the railroad, all for the convenience of Martin Pratt." Josiah turned from the window where he had been staring, his face illuminated by a distant dream. "It is not for his convenience. Abigail, it is for the glory of God. Think of it. A proper church, a building worthy of our congregation's devotion. The current building is humble, yes, but it is also drafty and small. This is a chance to build something that will last for a century. It is a deal with a man who gouges his neighbors for water and uses a flood to line his own pockets," she countered, her voice rising with a passion that surprised even herself. "His hands are not clean. We should not be taking anything from them." "You are being sentimental," he said, his tone dismissive. "Pratt is a shrewd businessman, I will grant you that, but his offer serves the greater good. The needs of the church, the needs of the entire congregation, must come before our attachment to an old wooden building." She stared at him, and the chasm that had been slowly opening between them for years suddenly yawned into a vast, uncrossable canyon. He did not see the moral compromise. He saw only the practical path to his goal. He was willing to sacrifice the heart of the community for a beautiful but empty shell. Her hand instinctively went to her bare ring finger. The lost ring was no longer just a symbol of their marriage. It was a symbol of this, a bond that had been eroded, a faith that had been misplaced, a love that had become secondary to ambition. She felt utterly and completely alone, abandoned by the one person who had sworn to stand by her. The question that had been forming in the back of her mind for weeks now took center stage. Was a marriage a sacred covenant between two hearts? Or was it just a role to be played for the approval of the community? Eli Harper, alone in his small room behind the forge, was asking himself different questions. He held the gold ring in his palm, watching it catch the lamplight. He knew what it likely meant. A secret affair. A payoff. A piece of leverage that could destroy Martin Pratt's reputation and his power in the town. Using it could stop the cynical land deal and protect the church. But what would be the cost? Pratt would not go down without a fight. He would drag everyone he could into the mud with him. And Abigail Bell, already the subject of cruel gossip, would be caught in the middle. They had been seen working at the creek. He had pulled her from the path of the stampede. It would be easy for a man like Pratt to twist those events into something ugly, to claim this ring was part of a conspiracy between the preacher's wife and the blacksmith. Eli's jaw tightened. He would not allow that. He would keep his silence. He would protect her honor, her safety, above all else. That was his code. It was the only piece of himself he had managed to salvage from the wreckage of his past. He would keep the ring, a secret ace in the hole. And wait. A blacksmith learns patience. He knows that you do not strike until the iron is hot enough, until the time is exactly right. The next day, the town was buzzing with talk of the new church. Deacon Pratt, feeling his victory was near, grew bolder. He saw Abigail walking home from the mercantile, across the street. Eli Harper was loading a newly repaired wagon wheel onto a rancher's cart. They were 100 feet apart, separated by the dust and bustle of the street, their paths unconnected. But in Pratt's eyes, they were intimately linked. He turned to the man standing next to him, a fellow member of the church council, and said, his voice dripping with false concern, "It is a strange thing. The preacher's wife seems to find herself in the blacksmith's path quite often these days. A woman in her position ought to be more careful of the company she appears to keep." The poison had been planted. The fuse had been lit. The church fundraising fair was meant to be a symbol of Dust Creek's resilience, a cheerful defiance of the drought. Trestle tables were arranged in the dusty churchyard, adorned with colorful quilts, jars of preserves, and the determined, hopeful faces of the town's women. The event pulsed with a fragile festivity, a collective effort to pretend that the sky was not a sheet of hot brass and the earth was not turning to powder beneath their feet. Abigail had been put in charge of the bookstall, a collection of donated primers, worn Bibles, and novels with cracked spines. It was a quiet corner of the fair, and for that, she was grateful. She had arranged the books with care, hoping to entice a few customers and add her small contribution to the fund for Josiah's new church, a project that now felt more like a monument to her husband's ambition than a house for their shared faith. Early in the morning, before the crowds arrived, Sheriff Latham's son, Thomas, had delivered a gift for her stall. It was a small bookshelf, crafted from sturdy oak, its joints fitted with a carpenter's precision. But it was the details that made Abigail catch her breath. The brackets supporting the shelves were not simple wood or cheap cast iron. They were hand-forged, hammered into the elegant, tapering shape of willow leaves, the veins of each leaf captured in the dark, textured steel. It was a piece of artistry, of time and strength and a quiet, patient skill. There was no card, no name attached, but she knew the hand that had made it as surely as she knew her own. Her fingers traced the cool, smooth curve of a metal leaf, and a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. She placed it in the center of her stall, a silent, beautiful testament to a kindness that asked for no acknowledgement. The fair was soon bustling. Hattie Mills was doing a brisk business, her voice booming over the crowd. "Get your drought special apple pie so dry, the apples had to be imported from the Garden of Eden itself. Price reflects the shipping costs. Folks." Eli Harper appeared at the edge of the crowd, his presence a quiet island in the sea of chatter. He was clean-shaven, wearing a plain linen shirt, and he looked uncomfortable, as if he had wandered into a foreign country. He avoided looking in Abigail's direction, his gaze fixed on Hattie's stall. He bought one of the expensive pies, and instead of taking it for himself, he turned and gave it to a small cluster of children from the railroad camp, whose parents could not afford such a luxury. "Sugar is rarer than gold in Dust Creek these days," he told them with a small, rare smile. "Make sure you get your share." The children's delighted faces were his only reward as he melted back toward the edge of the fair, keeping to the periphery. Abigail watched the exchange, her heart aching with a strange mix of gratitude and sorrow. He was a good man, a quiet, decent, honorable man, and it was this very goodness that was being twisted into something ugly to be used against her, as if summoned by the thought. Deacon Martin Pratt appeared before her stall, his wife, a pale, silent woman, trailing in his wake. Pratt's eyes swept over the meager collection of books, a smirk playing on his lips. Then his gaze fell on the new bookshelf. He ran a thick finger over one of the forged iron leaves. "A fine piece of craftsmanship," he said, his voice drawing the attention of those nearby, a gift from an admirer. Perhaps one has to appreciate a man who works with his hands. He paused, letting the insinuation hang in the hot, still air. He then turned his full attention to Abigail, his small eyes gleaming with malice. "It is a shame, Mistress Bell, that you cannot seem to hold on to fine things. If only you could find your ring as easily as you find your way to the smithy." The words, spoken in a tone of feigned sympathy, were as sharp and cruel as a shard of glass. A hush fell over the nearby stalls. Faces turned toward her, some curious, some pitying, some with the same undisguised malice as Pratt. Abigail felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold and numb. She saw him for what he was, a bully who used piety as a weapon. All her instincts screamed at her to flee, to hide from their staring, judgmental eyes. But then she felt the solid oak of the bookshelf beneath her hand, the cool, unyielding strength of the iron leaf. She thought of Eli's quiet dignity, his refusal to be drawn into the town's petty cruelties. She lifted her chin and met Pratt's gaze, her voice low and clear, trembling only slightly. "I seek the truth first. Deacon Pratt," she said, "the ring will follow." It was not the fiery retort he had expected. Her calm, measured dignity seemed to wrong-foot him. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, sputtering for a moment before turning on his heel and leading his wife away. The moment was broken. People turned back to their conversations, but the whispers followed in Pratt's wake. The poison now spread through the entire gathering. Josiah had witnessed the exchange from across the yard, where he was discussing fundraising totals with another deacon. He came over to her stall, his face a tight mask of displeasure. He waited until they were out of earshot of the nearest browser. "Abigail, this is precisely what I was concerned about," he said, his voice a frustrated hiss. "You are giving them ammunition. You must see how this looks." "How what looks, Josiah?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "That I was publicly insulted by a man you were about to make a deal with, that I refused to be shamed by his lies." "That you continue to associate with that blacksmith," he countered, his jaw tight. "I do not care what the truth of the matter is. It is the appearance that concerns me. It reflects poorly on me, on the church. For the sake of harmony, for the sake of our work, I'm asking you to avoid any and all contact with Eli Harper. It is a small price to pay for peace in the congregation." She looked at her husband. He was not her defender. He was not her partner. He was her warden, concerned only with the pristine appearance of their shared prison. The distance between them was no longer a silent, aching space. It was a declared and hostile territory. She gave a single, curt nod, the gesture feeling like a betrayal of the one person in town who had shown her any real kindness. Eli had seen it all from his place in the shadows at the edge of the churchyard. He had seen Pratt's attack, Abigail's brave defense, and the subsequent, tense conversation with her husband. A cold, familiar self-loathing washed over him. He was the cause of this. His presence, his simple acts of decency, were the raw material Pratt was forging into a weapon to hurt her. He had tried to keep his distance, but it was not enough. He was like a magnet for trouble, a dark cloud that inevitably brought the storm. To protect her, He would have to do more than just keep his distance. He would have to disappear from her life completely. He would have to make himself a ghost. The decision settled in his gut like a cold, heavy stone. Over the next few days, it was as if Eli Harper had ceased to exist. The clang of his hammer still rang out from the hollow anvil, but he was never seen. He took his meals in his room, and when he had to speak with a customer, he did so at the dark entrance of the forge, his words brief and his manner remote. When Abigail walked down the street, she no longer felt the subtle awareness of his presence. There were no more accidental glances, no more quiet acknowledgments. There was only a void. The emptiness was a relief, she told herself. It was what Josiah wanted. It would stop the gossip, but it felt like the last candle in a dark room had been snuffed out. Her small Sunday school class became her only refuge, but even that was threatened. Deacon Pratt, in his new capacity as head of the church's finance committee, had declared that certain expenditures were no longer sustainable. The first thing he cut was the small stipend for coal and lamp oil for Abigail's classes. In these trying times, his official notice read, "We must focus our resources on the spiritual, not the temporal, education of our youth." It was a petty, vindictive act, aimed directly at her, and it meant that as the autumn evenings grew colder and darker, she would have no way to heat or light the room for the children of the town's poorest families, the ones who could not learn at home. She did not tell anyone, too proud to admit that Pratt had found another way to wound her. But 2 days later, when she went to the church hall, she found a full sack of coal neatly stacked by the small pot-bellied stove. There was no note. None was needed. The drought held its grip on the land. The small flower patch Abigail tended behind the parsonage, a stubborn patch of color from her eastern home, was withering. The water from their well was rationed, barely enough for cooking and drinking. The thought of losing this last, small connection to beauty was more than she could bear. One afternoon, driven by a desperation she did not fully understand, she found herself walking near the smithy. It was late, the workday was over, and the street was empty. She saw him for the first time in over a week, standing by his water barrel, a silhouette against the fiery sunset. She stopped, her heart pounding. This was foolish. This was against Josiah's wishes. But the words came out before she could stop them. A small, quiet plea. "Mr. Harper, I lack the water for my flowers." He turned, and in the dim light she could see the surprise on his face, followed by a deep, weary sadness. He did not move closer. He kept the width of the dusty street between them, a gulf of propriety and his own pained resolve. "Mistress Bell," he said, his voice rough, as if from disuse, "I cannot forge rain." "I know," she whispered, her gaze falling to the ground. She felt foolish, ashamed. She turned to go, but his voice stopped her. "I can forge a device to catch the dew." She looked back at him. He stood tall and unmoving, a man holding himself in check by sheer force of will. The offer was so strange, so unexpected. It was not a solution, not really, but it was hope. It was a refusal to surrender to the drought. It was the most poetic thing anyone had ever said to her. "Thank you," she said softly, and hurried away before the tears in her eyes could fall. 2 days later, she found it on her back porch. It was a beautiful, strange object. A wide, shallow basin of hammered copper, polished to a warm sheen, was mounted on 3 elegantly curved iron legs that ended in scrolled feet, so they would not sink into the soil. It was both practical and beautiful, a creation of pure function that had been elevated to art. That night, she placed it among her thirsty flowers. The next morning, as the sun rose, she went out into the cool, gray dawn. The copper basin was filled with a small, precious pool of clear, clean water, condensed from the night air, drop by drop. The sky had offered a meager blessing, and this simple, elegant device had been there to receive it. Abigail dipped her fingers into the water. It was cold, real. She carried the basin to her wilting roses and gave them a drink. It was not enough to save them. Not yet, but it was a start. It was a promise. Each morning she would gather the dew, a quiet ritual of hope. She was gathering the drops, hoarding them against the long, dry season, waiting for the rain. The wind that night was a restless spirit, a dry, hot breath that scoured the Wyoming prairie and whispered through the cracks in Dust Creek's walls. It carried the scent of dust and distant, dying grasses, but no promise of rain. At the hollow anvil, the forge was not dark. A dull red glow pulsed from its heart, a defiant ember against the vast, star-pricked blackness of the sky. Eli Harper was not sleeping. He was at war with the earth. The flash flood had left a legacy of compacted mud and debris in the hollow behind his forge, turning his ash pit into a solid, useless mass. For days, he had ignored it, but the restless energy that had no other outlet now drove him to the task. He worked under the ghostly light of a single lantern, the rhythmic scrape and thud of his shovel the only sound besides the ceaseless moaning of the wind. Sweat slicked his back and arms, carving clean paths through the grime of coal dust and dirt. He was not just clearing the pit, he was digging, exorcising the helpless anger and frustration that had been building inside him for weeks. He dug until his shoulders burned and his hands were raw, punishing himself for the trouble his mere existence had brought upon Abigail Bell. His shovel struck something that was not soft ash or brittle slag. It made a faint, metallic chink, a sound different from the grating of rock. He paused, his breath coming in harsh rasps. He had found things in this pit before: old nails, a broken buckle, the detritus of 100 repairs. He knelt, curiosity overriding his exhaustion, and ran his fingers through the loose debris. He felt a small, smooth, circular object. A washer. Perhaps. He picked it up, its form indistinct in the thick grime. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger, the grit scraping away. And then he felt it, the unmistakable solid weight and smooth, cool feel of gold. He brought it to the lantern, his heart giving a sudden, violent lurch. He held it in his palm, the flickering light glinting off its surface. It was a simple, thin band, delicate and worn. It was not the crude, heavy ring with the initials M.P. This was a woman's ring, her ring. It must have been caught in the torrent of the dust storm, washed into the alley, and then carried by the flash flood to this final resting place, snagged in a tangle of old iron scraps at the bottom of his pit. He stood up slowly, the shovel forgotten in his hand. He closed his fist around the ring, the metal warming instantly against his skin. He felt a dizzying wave of triumph, followed by a heavier, more sobering sense of responsibility. He had found it. He could end the whispers, restore her honor, lift the terrible weight from her shoulders. But the thought of placing it in her hand, of seeing the look in her eyes, sent a tremor of pure, unadulterated fear through him. It was too much. It was too close, but he could not keep it. He could not let her continue to suffer. He had to give it back. The dawn broke cool and clear, the sky a pale, fragile gray. Abigail rose early, as she always did, her first thought on the small, precious pool of water that would be waiting for her in the copper basin. It was her morning ritual, a private act of faith that had come to mean more to her than any of Josiah's sermons. She stepped out onto the back porch of the parsonage, into the quiet hush that precedes the full heat of the day. He was waiting for her. He was not on the porch, not on church property. He stood just outside the low picket fence that separated the churchyard from the street, a tall, solid silhouette in the growing light. He was holding his hat in his hands, and his posture was stiff, formal, the posture of a man steeling himself for a difficult duty. Her heart fluttered in her chest, a startled bird. She stopped, her hand on the porch rail. They had not spoken, had not even met eyes, in over a week. To see him here, now, felt momentous and terrifying. He took a hesitant step forward, stopping at the fence. He did not speak at first. He simply looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a universe of weariness, respect, and a deep, aching sorrow. He slowly extended his hand, not to her, but over the fence. He was holding a small, folded piece of clean, dark cloth. With his other hand, he carefully unfolded it. There, nestled in the center of the cloth, lay her wedding ring. It glowed with a soft, warm life in the morning light. Impossibly beautiful, impossibly real. Abigail made a small sound, a choked gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. It was found. After all this time, after all the whispers and the shame, it was found. Eli's voice was low, so low she had to strain to hear it over the pounding of her own blood in her ears. It was a voice imbued with a profound, almost painful respect. "Mistress Bell," he began, his gaze steady and direct, holding hers. He took a breath. "The preacher's lonely wife lost her wedding ring. The blacksmith found it." He paused, and the air between them grew thick with unspoken meaning. With all the things he had seen and she had felt, I only dared to keep it safe. He did not offer the cloth to her. Instead, he took another step, reaching over the fence not toward her, but toward the copper dew-catcher that stood among her flowers. He did not touch her. His hand did not so much as brush her sleeve, with a tenderness that seemed at odds with his calloused, powerful hands. He gently tipped the cloth. The small gold band slid off and landed in the basin with a soft, pure chime, the sound of a single drop of rain. It settled in the shallow pool of dew, submerged in the hope he had forged for her. "As for what is in the heart," he finished, his voice now barely a whisper, "that must be returned to its rightful owner." He stepped back from the fence, his duty done. Abigail was trembling, not with relief, but with the force of a revelation that was shaking her to her very foundation. She looked at the ring, shining up at her from its bath of morning dew, and she understood. She understood that the pain of the last few weeks had not been about a lost piece of gold. It had been about being lost herself. It had been about being unseen, unheard, misunderstood. And this man, this quiet, solitary blacksmith, had understood everything. He had seen her loneliness, her quiet desperation, and had offered not judgment or pity, but silent, steady acts of kindness. He had returned her ring, but in doing so, he had handed her back a piece of her own heart, a piece she had not even known was missing. The ring was home, but her heart was now asking a different, more dangerous question. She finally found her voice. Though it was thick with unshed tears, she managed a small, watery smile. "Mr. Harper," she said softly, "do you have some secret for forging miracles?" A faint, sad smile touched his own lips. "No, ma'am," he said, "I forge patience." Neither of them was aware of the two sets of eyes that had witnessed the scene. From her bakery window, Hattie Mills had seen it all. She saw the respectful distance, the tender placement of the ring, the profound emotion that passed between them without a single touch. She saw a moment of pure, unadulterated decency, and she nodded to herself, a grim satisfaction on her face. She understood. But from the street corner, half hidden by the awning of the land office, Deacon Martin Pratt had seen it too, and he had interpreted it through the dark, twisted lens of his own corrupt soul. He saw a secret, pre-dawn meeting. He saw a clandestine exchange. He saw the preacher's wife and the blacksmith, their heads close together, their hushed tones a clear admission of a guilty conspiracy. He saw his leverage. Before the sun was fully over the horizon, Pratt had convened an emergency meeting with 2 other members of the church council, men whose loans he held and whose opinions he could easily sway. He painted a lurid picture of what he had seen, his voice dripping with sanctimonious horror. "A secret assignation," he declared, his jowls quivering with manufactured outrage. "At dawn, I saw it with my own eyes." He passed something to her, some token. "Her behavior has been a scandal to this community for weeks, and now we have proof of her impropriety. Her open defiance in the face of our concern cannot be tolerated." The deacons, suitably horrified and indebted, agreed. A formal inquiry into the moral conduct of the minister's wife was necessary. Josiah was summoned from his study, where he was happily sketching a plan for an altar rail. He listened, his face growing paler and paler as Pratt laid out the supposed evidence and the council's decision. He was trapped. To defend his wife would be to stand against the church leadership, to jeopardize the entire new church project, the dream of his life. To acquiesce would be to submit his wife to a humiliating, unjust public trial. "What would you have me do?" Josiah asked, his voice thin with panic. Pratt leaned in, his eyes small and hard as pebbles. "The matter is simple. Reverend, you are the spiritual leader of this community. You must show that you place the sanctity of the church above all else, above personal feelings, above loyalties." He paused, letting the word hang in the air. Then he delivered the final, crushing blow, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Or you could put a stop to all of it. A single signature on the land transfer agreement would be seen as a sign of your commitment to the church's future, a sign of your good faith in light of such a commitment. I am sure this unfortunate misunderstanding could be quietly forgotten, for the good of all. Of course." The threat was clear. "Ruin your wife or give me what I want." Josiah looked from Pratt's smug face to the architectural drawings on his desk, the beautiful, clean lines of the church that could be. He was a man caught between his ambition and his honor, and in that moment, Abigail, standing alone in her garden with her hands trembling as she reached for the ring in the copper basin, had never been more completely on her own. The hearing for that is what it was. A trial disguised as a concerned inquiry was held in the church. The air inside was heavy with the heat of the day and the thicker, more oppressive heat of self-righteous judgment. Abigail sat on a lone chair placed before the pulpit, facing the deacons and a handful of select, pious members of the congregation. Josiah sat with the deacons, his face pale and unreadable, his gaze fixed on his clasped hands. He was a judge in a case where his own wife was the accused. Deacon Pratt conducted the proceeding, his voice a smooth, oily blend of sorrow and accusation. He recounted the tale of the lost ring, Abigail's frequent presence near the smithy, and the final, damning proof of the secret dawn meeting he had witnessed with his own eyes. He painted a picture of moral decay, of a minister's wife who had lost not just her ring, but her virtue. When he finished, a thick, expectant silence filled the room. All eyes were on Abigail. She felt a tremor of fear, but beneath it was a bedrock of cold, hard anger. She looked at the faces before her, at her husband who would not meet her eye, and she knew that she was utterly alone. And in that solitude, she found her strength. She rose to her feet, her posture straight, her hands folded calmly before her. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with a quiet, unshakable clarity that cut through the sanctimonious atmosphere like a clean, sharp blade. She told them everything: the dust storm, the panic of losing a precious heirloom, the desperate, methodical search, the stampede, and how Mr. Harper had saved her from injury, the kindness of the repaired benches, the gift of the bookshelf, the quiet delivery of coal for her students. She told them of the dew-catcher, an act of charity for a few withering flowers. And finally, she told them of the morning he had returned her ring, keeping a respectful distance, placing it not in her hand but in the basin, an act of profound and unimpeachable honor. "Mr. Harper," she concluded, her voice unwavering, "has shown me nothing but the decency and respect that is the true mark of a Christian gentleman, a decency that, I must say, has been sorely lacking elsewhere in this town." Pratt scoffed. "A touching story. But where is this blacksmith? Why is he not here to defend his own actions?" As if on cue, the church doors creaked open. Eli Harper stood silhouetted against the harsh afternoon light. He was not dressed for a hearing. He was in his work clothes, his sleeves rolled up, a smudge of soot on his cheek. He had clearly come straight from the forge. He walked slowly down the aisle, his heavy work boots making no sound on the wooden floor. He stopped beside Abigail's chair, a silent, solid presence. He did not look at her. He addressed the deacons. "I was not invited," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "But I am here. Everything Mistress Bell has said is the truth. I have never been anything but respectful of her, and of her marriage. I have kept my distance. Any man who says otherwise is a liar." His gaze settled on Martin Pratt, and for a fleeting moment, the carefully controlled patience in his eyes was replaced by a fire as hot as his forge. Pratt's composure wavered for a second. The word of an outsider and a disgraced woman against a deacon of this church. "Perhaps we need another word." "Then," the voice boomed from the back of the church. Hattie Mills stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her formidable chest. She marched down the aisle like a general taking the field, her face set in a grim, determined scowl. In her outstretched hand, she held a man's gold wedding band. "I believe this belongs to you, Deacon Pratt." Pratt's face turned the color of spoiled milk. He stared at the ring as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. Hattie was not finished. She pointed a thick finger at him. "This is the ring my girls and I found in the mud after the flash flood. This is the ring with the initials MP scratched inside it." She paused, her eyes sweeping the shocked faces of the deacons. "And I believe young Martha, who does the laundry for the boarding house, can tell you exactly how it came to be lost in the creek bed." From the shadows near the door, a young woman stepped forward. She was pale and trembling, her eyes fixed on the floor. It was Martha, the laundress, a girl barely 18. He gave it to me," she whispered, her voice cracking with fear and shame. "Deacon Pratt, he bothered me by the creek. He gave me the ring and some money to keep quiet about his attentions." Her story tumbled out, a sordid, heartbreaking tale of a powerful man preying on a vulnerable girl, a secret that had been poisoning the town from within. The room erupted in chaos. The deacons were on their feet, shouting questions. Pratt, his face a mask of purple fury, was trapped. His lies, his hypocrisy, all of it lay exposed on the church floor. He looked from the laundress's tear-streaked face to Eli's stony expression, and his eyes filled with a desperate, venomous hatred. He had been beaten, but he would not be defeated. He would burn it all down before he let them win. He turned and stormed out of the church, a man fleeing the wreckage of his own making. Night fell, but the drama was far from over. A new, more terrible light began to bloom in the darkness. A frantic cry went up from the street. "Fire! The smithy is on fire!" The hollow anvil was engulfed in flames. Orange and yellow tongues of fire licked at the night sky, devouring the dry timber of the old building. A pillar of black. Greasy smoke billowed upwards, carrying with it the panicked, angry shouts of the townspeople. Pratt had acted quickly. He had hired 2 disreputable drifters from the saloon to do his dirty work, to destroy the place that held the proof of his lies, the slag heap where Abigail's ring had been found, the dew-catcher that was a symbol of Eli's kindness, the very forge that represented the blacksmith's unyielding integrity. The town, which hours before had been a collection of fractured, gossiping individuals, now became a single, desperate organism with one goal: survival. If the smithy went, the intense heat could easily cause the fire to jump to the livery stable next door, and from there, the whole tinder-dry town could be consumed. A bucket brigade formed instantly, a frantic human chain stretching from the town's main well to the roaring inferno. Abigail was in the line, her face smudged with soot, her arms aching as she passed the heavy, sloshing buckets. She worked alongside Hattie Mills, Sheriff Latham, the children from her Sunday school class, and men who had been drinking in the saloon an hour earlier. The divisions of piety and sin, of reputation and rumor, were washed away by the common threat. Then she saw a figure emerge from the parsonage, his face stark with a horror that was not just for the town, but for his own soul. It was Josiah, He was still wearing his formal minister's coat. He stood for a moment, paralyzed, watching the chaos. Then, in a gesture that was more significant than any sermon he had ever preached, he shrugged off the coat, threw it to the ground, and ran to take a place in the line, his soft hands grasping the rough handle of a bucket. He looked at Abigail, his eyes filled with a dawning, terrible understanding of how much he had failed her, and began to work. Eli was a man possessed. He was not fighting the fire from the safety of the line. He was in the heart of the danger, dousing the walls, trying to save the tools that were his livelihood, his very identity. The heat was a physical blow, the smoke a choking blanket. Suddenly, a deafening roar erupted from inside the forge. The great leather bellows that fed air to the fire had superheated and exploded, sending a shower of burning embers and white-hot sparks into the night. At that exact moment, the nightly freight train thundered past on the tracks behind the buildings. The massive displacement of air from the speeding train acted like a giant fan, sucking the new explosion of fire outwards, directly toward the bucket brigade. Eli saw it happen in a split second. The wall of sparks, the cowering figure of Abigail, her face illuminated by the approaching fire. He moved without thinking. He lunged toward her, tackling her to the ground, covering her body with his own as the deadly shower of embers rained down around them. He grunted as a piece of burning shrapnel struck his shoulder, the pain a distant, unimportant fact. The moment passed. The fire was beaten back. The townspeople, working with a renewed, desperate energy, began to gain the upper hand. And in the smoky, hellish light, Sheriff Latham saw two figures trying to slip away into the darkness behind the buildings. He also saw Deacon Pratt, who had been watching from the shadows, making a frantic gesture at the two men, urging them to finish the job. "Stop right there," Latham's voice cut through the din. He drew his pistol, and his deputies moved in. Apprehending the two hired arsonists, Latham himself walked directly up to Martin Pratt. "Pratt," he said, his voice cold with contempt, "you are under arrest for arson and attempted murder." He snapped the handcuffs onto the deacon's wrists, the metallic click a final, decisive sound in the dying roar of the fire. As the last of the flames were extinguished, an eerie calm settled over the scene. The hollow anvil was a blackened, smoking ruin, but in the center of the wreckage, miraculously, a single object stood untouched. The copper dew-catcher, though blackened with soot, was not melted or broken. It had survived the inferno, its elegant curves a testament to the enduring power of a simple, beautiful kindness. Josiah walked over to where Abigail was helping Eli to his feet. He looked at the burn on the blacksmith's shoulder, and then at his wife's soot-streaked, tear-stained, beautiful face. The ambition, the pride, the fear, it all fell away, leaving only a vast, hollow regret. He turned to the crowd of exhausted, grimy townspeople who had gathered in the street. "I have been a fool," he said, his voice thick with emotion, but carrying in the sudden silence. "I have been so consumed with building a house of stone that I failed to care for the people within it. I have been preaching about faith, but I have not been listening. I have not listened to my wife. I have not listened to my own heart. For that, I ask for your forgiveness and for hers." He looked at Abigail, and for the first time in years, she saw not a minister, but the man she had married, his eyes filled with a devastating and complete understanding of all that they had lost. Hattie Mills, wiping a sweaty brow with the back of a sooty hand, let out a long, weary sigh. "Well," she declared to the town at large, "that is the first time I have ever seen a blacksmith manage to get a rumor well and truly roasted." A few exhausted chuckles broke the tension, a ripple of relief through the weary crowd. Abigail looked at the smoking ruins of the smithy, at the captured deacon, at her husband's broken expression, at the quiet, steady man standing beside her, wincing in pain but with his eyes full of concern for her. She began to cry. The tears were not for what was lost, but for what had been found. They were tears of relief, of sorrow, of gratitude, And they were tears for the choice that now lay before her, clear and sharp and unavoidable as a shard of newly broken glass. The fire was out, but the future was an unknown territory, waiting to be forged. In the gray, sober light of the morning after the fire, Dust Creek was a town transformed. The night of shared terror and desperate, unified effort had burned away the petty crust of gossip and suspicion, revealing a tougher, more resilient core. The air, still thick with the acrid smell of smoke and quenched embers, also carried something new, a quiet, bone-deep sense of community. Justice, when it came, was swift and unadorned. Sheriff Latham, his face grim and weary, had the two drifters locked in his jail cells. They had confessed before the sun was fully up, naming Martin Pratt as the man who paid them in whiskey and silver to set the blaze, with the testimony of the young laundress, Martha, added to the charges of arson and attempted murder. Pratt's reign of pious tyranny was over. By noon, he was on a prison wagon, bound for the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne, his face a mask of pasty, impotent rage. He was no longer Deacon Pratt, a pillar of the community. He was just a criminal, his name already turning to ash in the mouths of the people he had tried to rule. The church council, shamed and sobered, met that afternoon. They unanimously rejected the railroad's land deal, voting to repair and keep the original church, the one built by their fathers and grandfathers. The vote was not just about land. It was a recommitment to the town's soul over the allure of empty progress. That evening, the parsonage was quieter than a tomb. Abigail and Josiah sat at the small dining table, the space between them filled with years of unspoken words, the architectural drawings for the new church, the catalyst for so much of their recent pain, lay in a discarded roll in the corner. Josiah was the first to speak, his voice low and hollowed out, stripped of all its sermonizing fire. "I saw you last night," he began, his eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden table, in the bucket line. "You were so strong, so unafraid, and I was hiding in here with my plans and my pride." He finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, and she saw in his eyes a sorrow so profound it startled her. "Our marriage, Abigail, it has been like this drought. For a long, long time, I was so busy looking at the sky, praying for a sign, that I never noticed the ground at my feet was cracking. I never noticed you were thirsty." "I was," she said, her voice a simple, honest whisper. "We both were." "Yes," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It was the first honest, unburdened expression she had seen on his face in years. "I offered you scripture when you needed water. I offered you duty when you needed a husband." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "The fire, it burned away a great deal of foolishness in me. I saw you with him, with Harper. I saw how he protected you. And I saw that he has been a better guardian of your well-being than I have ever been." He reached across the table, not to touch her, but as a simple gesture of offering, "I release you, Abigail, from our vows, from this life that has become a cage for your spirit. If there is a chance for you to find happiness, to find someone who will listen, then you must take it. God's grace is not found in a loveless duty." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of a painful, liberating gratitude. He had finally seen her. In letting her go, he was, at last, truly with her. The path forward was made clear and respectable by the very men who represented the law and the faith of the territory. Sheriff Latham, a man of simple, solid principles, and a traveling circuit minister, a man with kind eyes and a deep understanding of human frailty, met with them both. The minister explained that under the laws of the Wyoming Territory, an annulment was possible. Their marriage, entered into with youthful idealism and never fully realized in the truest, most intimate sense, combined with their long-standing spiritual separation, provided legal and religious grounds. The process would be discreet, dignified, and final. It was not a divorce, with its connotations of sin and failure, but an acknowledgement that a true marriage had never fully taken root in this dry, unforgiving soil. While the legal papers were being drawn and the slow wheels of territorial justice turned, Eli Harper kept his distance. His forge was a ruin, but the town would not let him rebuild it alone. Men who had once viewed him with suspicion now showed up with salvaged timbers and strong backs. He accepted their help with a quiet, grateful nod, his arm in a sling from the burn he had received protecting Abigail. He directed the work, his mind and hands occupied, but his heart was in a state of patient, agonizing suspense. He saw Abigail from a distance, at the mercantile or walking with her students, and each time he felt a pull so strong it was a physical pain. But he held himself back. He would not approach her, would not speak to her, would not add a single twig to the dying embers of gossip. He would wait until she was free, truly and completely. He ran a hand over the corner of his anvil, which had been chipped and scarred by a falling, burning beam. He looked at the mark, a wound in the steel. The iron, he thought to himself, is not yet red enough to forge. One must wait for the proper heat. The town's healing continued, mirroring the slow reconstruction of the smithy. The whispers about Abigail had died out, replaced by a quiet, widespread respect. The women who had once eyed her with suspicion now greeted her with warm smiles. Her little school, held in the repaired church hall, began to grow. First, 2 children of the Sioux who traded near the town asked to join, their parents wanting them to learn the white man's words. Then, a few of the rough, Irish children from the railroad workers' camp, their faces scrubbed clean, appeared shyly at her door. Abigail welcomed them all, her classroom becoming a small, unlikely tapestry of the New West, a place where all were equal in their thirst for knowledge. And then, one afternoon, the sky opened. It was not a violent storm, but a soft, steady, life-giving rain. It fell for hours, washing the dust from the air, turning the streets a dark, rich brown, and releasing a scent of wet earth and sage that was the most beautiful perfume in the world. Abigail stood on her back porch, her face tilted up to the sky, letting the cool, clean drops run down her cheeks like tears of joy. The copper dew-catcher, which had so faithfully collected its meager drops each morning, was overflowing, a small, beautiful symbol of a hope that had been answered beyond all measure. A few days later, Hattie Mills appeared at the parsonage door, holding a freshly baked peach pie that smelled of cinnamon and heaven. "This is a celebration pie," she announced. Bustling into the kitchen, "I am a firm believer in 2 things. Mistress Bell, a woman's right to choose her own path, and a man who knows when to keep a respectful distance. You have found the first, and you have been found by the second. That is worth at least 1 free pie." The annulment was finalized on a clear, cool day in late autumn. Josiah, his face calmer and more peaceful than Abigail had ever seen it, packed his few belongings. He was moving to a small parish in Cheyenne, a new start. Before he left, he walked over to the half-rebuilt smithy. Eli was there, directing the placement of a new roof beam. Josiah extended his hand. "Harper," he said, his voice clear and steady, "take care of her." Eli looked at the offered hand, then into the former minister's eyes. He saw no jealousy, only a sincere and humble request. He took Josiah's hand and shook it. A firm, binding grip. "I will," was all he said. That evening, Abigail took her mother's wedding ring, now clean and bright, and placed it inside a small, carved wooden box. She wrapped the box in a soft cloth and put it at the bottom of her travel trunk. It was not a rejection of the past, but a respectful closing of a chapter that was now over. In the ruins of his forge, lit by the glow of a single lantern, Eli began a new project. He took a piece of steel from an old, broken wagon wheel, a piece that had traveled hundreds of miles and known both hardship and endurance. He began to heat it in the small, temporary forge the men had helped him build. While he worked, the children of the town, her students, came to him one by one. They had heard of his task, in the way that children hear of all important secrets. They brought him their treasures, a tiny nugget of gold panned from the creek, a small gold button from a grandmother's dress, a single, delicate gold earring. They were small, insignificant pieces on their own, but together they were enough. Eli began the slow, patient process of hammering the tough wagon steel and the soft, precious gold, forging a new ring. A ring not of the East, not of a lonely duty, but a ring of Dust Creek itself. A ring forged from strength, community, and a love that had been tested in the fire. With Josiah's departure, a profound quiet settled over the parsonage, a silence no longer heavy with unspoken tensions, but light with the clean, empty space of possibility. Abigail, no longer Mistress Bell, but simply Abigail, found herself breathing more deeply, as if the air itself had been scrubbed clean by the recent rains. The town of Dust Creek, having passed through its own trial by fire, treated her not with pity or suspicion, but with a simple, matter-of-fact kindness. She was their teacher, a fixed point in the town's new landscape. The past had been scoured away, leaving behind the hard, true ground of the present. A new, unspoken rhythm began. Eli Harper, his arm now free of its sling, worked tirelessly to finish the reconstruction of his smithy. The building rose from its ashes, stronger than before, its new timbers smelling of fresh-cut pine and determination. He and Abigail did not rush. Their courtship was a slow, quiet unfolding, a series of small, respectful gestures that spoke more than 1,000 flowery words ever could. He would leave a bucket of clean water on her back porch in the evenings, a silent supplement to the well. She would leave a wrapped parcel of fresh bread on the anvil in the mornings, food to fuel his long day's work. They took to walking in the evenings. After her students had gone home and his forge had cooled, they did not walk down Main Street, under the watchful eyes of the town, but followed the winding path along Dry Creek, which now held a thin, silver trickle of water from the recent rains. They spoke of small things, the stubbornness of a particular roof beam, the surprising wit of a young Sioux boy learning his letters, the changing colors of the prairie as autumn deepened its hold. In these quiet conversations, Abigail felt a lifetime of loneliness begin to dissolve. He listened. It was a simple, profound gift. He would watch her face as she spoke, his stormy eyes attentive, and his quiet nods of understanding were more comforting than any grand declaration. She, in turn, learned the silent language of his hands, the way they could be gentle with a frightened horse or immensely powerful against a piece of stubborn steel. She learned the rare, slow smile that transformed his stern face. A smile she was beginning to realize was reserved only for her. One afternoon, a week after Josiah had gone, Eli appeared at the schoolhouse door just as she was dismissing her last student. He held his hat in his hands, a gesture of formality that made her heart beat a little faster. "Abigail," he said, the use of her first name a gentle, deliberate step across a threshold. "Will you walk with me to the bridge?" She smiled. "Of course, Eli." They walked in comfortable silence, the setting sun casting their long shadows before them. The air was cool and carried the scent of wood smoke and the rich, damp smell of the healing earth. They came to the small wooden footbridge that spanned Dry Creek, the same bridge the town had fought so hard to save from the flood. It stood as a humble monument to their shared struggle. They stopped in the middle, leaning on the wooden rail and looking down at the slow-moving water below. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The sky was a masterpiece of pale pink and soft violet, and the vast silence of the prairie settled around them like a comforting blanket. Finally, Eli turned to her. His face was serious, and she could see a vulnerability in his eyes she had never seen before, the look of a strong man venturing into unmapped territory. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, crudely made wooden box. He held it in his palm, his calloused, powerful hand trembling almost imperceptibly. "I am not a man of many words, Abigail," he began, his voice a low, rough murmur. "My whole life has been about fixing what is broken, mending wheels, shoeing horses, rebuilding this forge. He looked down at the box. I cannot promise to mend the sky. I cannot promise to forge rain. He lifted his gaze, and his eyes held hers, full of a fierce, unwavering sincerity. But I can promise to forge a home, a place of warmth and strength, a place where you will always be heard. He opened the box. Lying on a small piece of dark velvet was the most beautiful and unusual ring she had ever seen. It was not a simple, delicate band of gold. It was a ring of two metals, intricately woven together. A strong, dark band of hammered steel formed the core, and intertwined with it, like a determined vine, was a bright, warm thread of gold. It was not perfect or polished. She could see the faint marks of the hammer, the places where the two different metals had been joined in the fire. It was a ring of scars and strength, of utility and beauty. It was a ring that told a story. Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, blurring the beautiful, imperfect ring into a shimmering star. She looked from the ring to his face, and she saw her future, a future of honesty, of partnership, of a quiet, unshakable love. She smiled through her tears, a smile of pure, unburdened joy. I do not need miracles, Eli, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I just need someone who knows how to listen. She reached out and placed her hand over his. Yes, my answer is yes. A slow, wondrous smile spread across Eli's face, the smile of a man who had not dared to hope for such a thing. He took the ring from the box, his large fingers seeming clumsy and uncertain for the first time. As he went to place it on her finger, a sudden, playful gust of wind swept down the creek bed, rattling the loose planks of the bridge. It caught the small wooden box in his palm, lifting it for a terrifying second before it clattered onto the bridge, thankfully not into the water below. Eli let out a strangled noise of alarm, snatching for the box, his face a comical mask of panic. Abigail laughed, a clear, ringing sound of pure happiness that echoed in the quiet evening air. Careful, Blacksmith, she teased gently, her eyes dancing. It seems you are more nervous holding a ring than you are holding a hammer. He looked at her, his brief panic melting into a sheepish, heartfelt grin. A hammer, he said, his voice full of wonder as he finally slid the beautiful, strange ring onto her finger, is a much simpler thing than a heart. Their wedding was not held in a church. It was held on the open prairie, on a small rise overlooking Dust Creek, with the vast, endless sky as their cathedral. It was a simple gathering of friends, a testament to the community that had been forged in the same fire that had brought them together. Hattie Mills, beaming like a proud mother, had baked a magnificent three-tiered cake, decorated not with frosting, but with crystallized wild plums, the children from Abigail's school, a boisterous, happy mix of settlers, Sioux and railroad workers' children, acted as her attendants, scattering the pale, delicate petals of cactus flowers at her feet. Sheriff Latham, his badge polished brightly on his chest, officiated the ceremony, his voice, usually used for delivering warrants and keeping the peace, now gentle and full of warmth. Abigail wore a simple blue dress, the color of the Wyoming sky after a storm, and Eli stood beside her, tall and proud in a new, dark coat. As they stood hand in hand, facing the sheriff, the distant, lonesome whistle of the afternoon train echoed across the prairie. It was no longer a sound of intrusion or a painful reminder of a world left behind. It was a sound of life, of connection, a part of the vast, wild, beautiful landscape they now called home. It sounded, to Abigail, like a blessing. Their vows were not taken from a book. They were spoken from the heart. Simple promises in simple words. They promised to love, to honor, and to respect. They promised to build their lives together, side by side. They vowed to keep the school and the smithy as the two strong pillars of their family and of the town. One to shape the minds of the future, the other to shape the steel that would build it. The changes in Dust Creek had continued. The new church council, humbled and with a newfound sense of purpose, had voted to provide a permanent public fund for the town's school, ensuring that any child, regardless of their family's station, could receive an education. A few days after the wedding, a small delegation of Sioux from a nearby camp arrived, not with weapons, but with sacks of a special, hardy strain of corn, bred to survive the driest of seasons. They traded their knowledge and their seeds for Eli's well-made tools and Hattie's sweet pies, a new and hopeful partnership built on mutual respect. That evening, after the last of the wedding guests had departed, Eli and Abigail walked back to the small, sturdy house he had built next to the smithy. The forge, fully rebuilt, stood dark and silent, waiting for the morning. Eli stopped before the great scarred anvil that had survived the fire. He took a piece of kindling and struck a match. The flame sputtered, then caught, and he lit the bed of coal in the forge. A small, orange glow began to pulse in the darkness, growing steadily. A new fire and a new hearth. Abigail stood beside him, her hand in his. She looked at the ring on her finger, the dark steel and the bright gold forever intertwined, a symbol of their past and their future. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, from the lonely preacher's wife who had lost her way, to this woman, standing beside the man she loved, her heart full, her future as wide and open as the Wyoming sky. The fire in the forge caught, and the new light danced in their eyes, a promise of the life they would now forge together. Autumn settled over Dust Creek like a benediction. The relentless, brassy glare of summer softened into a deep, benevolent blue. The wind, no longer a hot, scouring breath carrying grit and despair, was now a cool, clean whisper that smelled of curing grasses, distant pine, and from Hattie Mills's bakery, the sharp, sweet promise of apple pie. A herd of pronghorn antelope, bold in the new peace of the season, flowed like a tawny river across the prairie just east of town, their white rumps flashing in the morning sun. Dust Creek was alive, its colors more vibrant, its air more breathable, its heart beating with a slow, steady, and contented rhythm. The woman who was once known as the preacher's lonely wife was gone, replaced by Abigail Harper, the teacher of Dust Creek. The name felt as comfortable and true as the simple wool shawl she now wore against the morning chill. Her life was no longer defined by the four walls of a parsonage or the silent, echoing spaces between prayers. It was defined by the scrape of chalk on a slate, the rustle of turning pages, and the bright, eager faces of her students. She was no longer a symbol of someone else's virtue. She was a creator of her own, a woman whose worth was measured in the daily, tangible progress of the children in her care. Eli Harper, too, was a man remade. The fire that had destroyed his forge had also burned away the last of the shadows that had kept him at the town's periphery. He was still a man of few words, his nature as steady and reserved as the deep-rooted mountains to the west. But he was no longer just the town's blacksmith. He was its anchor. Men came to him not just with broken plows, but with broken plans, seeking the quiet, practical wisdom of a man who knew how to make things whole again. He was the silent partner in a new irrigation scheme, the midwife to the idea of a volunteer fire brigade, his forge the warm, beating heart of the town's most practical and hopeful ambitions. Their home, the small, solid house next to the rebuilt smithy, was a quiet haven filled with the scent of sawdust, baking bread, and the faint, clean smell of hot iron. It was a place of comfortable silences and easy conversation, a testament to a love that did not require constant declaration because it was lived in every shared meal, every quiet glance, every small, unconscious gesture of care. One afternoon, while Eli was at the forge, Abigail took a moment for herself. She opened the travel trunk that sat at the foot of their bed and took out the small, carved wooden box. Inside, her mother's thin gold wedding band lay on a bed of soft cotton. Beside it, she had placed the beautiful copper dew catcher, now polished to a warm glow, its elegant iron legs folded neatly. She ran a finger over the cool, smooth surface of the ring. It held no pain for her now, only a gentle, compassionate memory of the young, lost woman she had once been. It was a part of her story, a testament to a past she had survived, not one she needed to escape. She thought of Josiah, who, by all accounts, had found a quiet purpose in his new parish in Cheyenne, a purpose better suited to his solitary, intellectual faith. She hoped he had learned to listen, to see the human hearts behind the abstract principles. She knew she had. She had learned to ask for what she needed, to give voice to the thirst in her own soul, a lesson more valuable than any she had ever found in a book. She looked at the dew-catcher, the beautiful, strange object that had been the first true bridge across the chasm of her loneliness. It was a symbol of Eli's patience, of his profound understanding that some things cannot be forced, but must be waited for. Gathered drop by precious drop, he had waited for her, respecting the boundaries of her old life with an honor that had been her shield. He had learned patience in the heat of his forge, but he had perfected it in the quiet waiting of his heart. Their love was like the pieces in her box, a past that was honored but not allowed to rule, and a hope that had been patiently, beautifully forged. She closed the lid, the past put respectfully away, and felt the solid, comforting weight of the steel and gold ring on her own finger, the ring of her present and her future. The fire that had been meant to destroy them had instead become the town's founding myth, the shared trial that had burned away the old divisions. The railroad, once a symbol of the threatening, encroaching outside world, was now just a part of the town's daily rhythm. Its whistle a familiar call that marked the passage of time. Its presence brought new goods to the mercantile and new students to Abigail's school. Its steel tracks a thread that connected them to the wider world without overwhelming them. The land itself, once a harsh, unforgiving adversary, had softened with the autumn rains, offering up a late, sparse bounty of wild plums and hardy grasses. The conflicts that had nearly torn Dust Creek apart society, nature, technology had found a new, harmonious balance. One crisp Saturday, the entire school gathered at the smithy. Eli, with Abigail at his side, was fulfilling a promise. He was teaching the older children how to forge a bell for the schoolhouse. He had set up a small, portable anvil, and he guided their small, hesitant hands, his large, scarred ones covering theirs as they learned the surprising weight and feel of the hammer. The children, a mix of every creed and color the territory had to offer, were wide-eyed with a kind of sacred excitement. They were not just making an object, they were making a voice for their own small community of learning. Hattie Mills stood nearby, a basket of fresh, warm cider donuts in her hand, watching the proceedings with a proprietary air. "You see," she said to Sheriff Latham, who was leaning against a post, a rare, relaxed smile on his face, "that is how you build a town, not with fancy plans and stone walls, but with good iron and honest hands." She looked over at Eli and Abigail, who had paused for a moment, his arm resting lightly on her shoulder, their faces lit by the soft glow of the hot metal. "Of course," Hattie added, her voice full of dry, affectionate wisdom. "It helps to have the right people tending the fire. If love is a furnace, you had best find yourself a blacksmith who knows how to bank the coals for the long night." Later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the small, imperfectly shaped bell was finished. Eli hung it from a new iron bracket he had forged above the schoolhouse door. The youngest student, a shy Sioux girl named Little Fawn, was given the honor of the first ring. She pulled the rope, and a clear, sweet, slightly off-key chime rang out over the quiet town. It was not a grand or solemn sound. It was the sound of children's hands, of shared work, of a new beginning. Inside the schoolhouse, the lanterns were lit, casting a warm, golden glow. Abigail was at the front of the room, reading a story to the younger children who had gathered around her. It was a tale about a great desert and a single, stubborn flower that learned how to find water deep beneath the sand. As she read, she looked up and saw Eli standing in the doorway, listening, his face softened by the lantern light. Their eyes met across the room, a silent exchange of love and peace so complete it needed no words. He was her home. She was his. In Dust Creek, they came to believe that every lost ring could eventually find its way home, if there was a hand skilled enough to forge and a heart patient enough to wait. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to connect with you, so please comment with where you are listening from. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night and like this video, and show your support by pressing the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.